Texas was free. On April 21, 1836, 18 minutes of battle at San Jacinto had done what seemed impossible. A ragged collection of farmers, frontiersmen, recent immigrants, and desperate volunteers had defeated the army of a sovereign nation. Santa Anna had been captured. The treaties of Velasco had been signed. The Republic of Texas had been born. And then the celebrating stopped, and the reality set in. Because being independent and being stable are two very different things, and the men who had just won a revolution were about to discover that winning was, in some ways, the easy part. The new republic had approximately 30,000 Anglo settlers, a handful of Tejano communities, thousands of enslaved people with no legal voice, and somewhere to the west, stretching across a territory that Texas claimed but could not remotely control, the Comanche Nation, the most formidable military power on the southern plains, an empire that neither Texas, nor Mexico, nor Spain before them had ever truly defeated. The national debt stood at $10 million. For a nation of 30,000 people, with no tax base and a currency that was already becoming a joke. Mexico refused to recognize Texas's independence, and every few months, Mexican forces crossed back into Texas just to remind everyone that the war was not, as far as Mexico was concerned, actually over. Sam Houston, the hero of San Jacinto, became the first president of the Republic of Texas. He was a brilliant, complicated, hard-drinking man who understood the situation with devastating clarity. He wrote in his private correspondence that Texas was not so much a republic as a prayer, a belief that if they could just hold on long enough, the United States would eventually agree to take them in. He was right. But it would take 10 years. 10 years of debt, invasion, massacre, failed diplomatic gambits, political chaos, and the slow, grinding erasure of the people who had actually built this land before any American settler ever arrived. Stay with us, because this is the decade that American history almost never tells you about, and it explains everything about why the Mexican-American War happened the way it did. This is video 28 of the Nostalgia History Mexican-American War series. If you missed video 27, The Real Story of the Alamo, I'll link it below. But today we pick up exactly where we left off, April 1836. The smoke of San Jacinto has cleared, and Texas is trying to figure out what it actually is.
Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell the story. The financial catastrophe. When Texas declared independence in March of 1836, it inherited essentially nothing from Mexico. No treasury, no functioning tax system, no established trade relationships, no recognized currency. The provisional government had funded the revolution by borrowing, by issuing promises, and by hoping. The national debt of the new Republic of Texas was approximately $10 million. This sounds like a modest figure until you understand the context. The entire taxable population of Texas was around 30,000 people. There were almost no established businesses to tax. There were farms, but farms produce food, not revenue, unless you have markets to sell to. The infrastructure to collect taxes barely existed. And the first thing any new government needs to do, pay its soldiers, maintain its army, fund its courts, required cash that Texas simply did not have. So Texas did what desperate governments do. It printed money. The Republic of Texas issued paper currency, what contemporary accounts called redbacks because of the red ink on the reverse side. In theory, these were legal tender. In practice, they were almost immediately regarded with deep skepticism by anyone who received them. Within a few years, redbacks were trading at a fraction of their face value. Some merchants refused to accept them at all. Texas was a republic whose money was not quite real. The army that didn't exist. The Texas army that had won at San Jacinto was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a professional standing force. It was a collection of volunteers who had come to fight a specific battle. Many of them had come from the United States specifically because of the revolution. They were adventurers, idealists, men looking for land, men running from something back home. They had fought, they had won, and now, with Santa Anna in custody and the Mexican army retreating south, many of them saw no particular reason to stick around. The Texas army dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. The men went home or back to wherever they had come from. Sam Houston, still recovering from the ankle wound he had taken at San Jacinto, found himself commander of an army that was mostly theoretical. This left Texas in an extraordinary vulnerability. Mexico had not recognized the Republic's independence. There was every reason to expect a Mexican counteroffensive. The Comanche, who had nothing to do with the revolution and were unimpressed by it, continued raiding Anglo settlements in central and western Texas with complete freedom.
The eastern border with the United States was porous and contested. Texas needed an army. It had no money to pay one. It had no established system to raise one. This was the central problem of the Republic's entire existence, and it would never be fully solved. Sam Houston, the first president. Sam Houston was elected the Republic's first president in September 1836. He received about 79% of the vote, which sounds overwhelming until you understand that his main opponent was Stephen F. Austin, and Austin died of pneumonia in December 1836, just months after the election. Texas lost in the space of a year both its revolution and the man who had built the settlement that made the revolution possible. Houston was 53 years old, tall and physically imposing, with a personal history that was legendary even before San Jacinto. He had been a soldier under Andrew Jackson. He had served as governor of Tennessee. He had left his first wife under circumstances that were never entirely explained, retreated to live among the Cherokee for years, married a Cherokee woman, and then eventually made his way to Texas. He was, depending on who you asked, a statesman, a drunk, a genius, a fraud, or some combination of all four. He was also the only man in Texas with the personal authority to hold the new republic together through its first crisis. Houston understood one thing with absolute clarity: Texas could not survive on its own. The question was not whether Texas would eventually join the United States. The question was how long it would take and what would happen to Texas in the meantime. His first act as president was to apply for annexation by the United States. He expected a fairly quick yes. He did not get one. Why the United States said no. The United States in 1836 was in the middle of its own political crisis, a slow-burning confrontation over the expansion of slavery that would consume American politics for the next 25 years and ultimately end in the bloodiest war the country had ever seen. Texas wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. The Republic's Constitution not only permitted slavery, it explicitly protected it. Any enslaved person in Texas was enslaved under Texas law, and that protection was woven into the Republic's foundational document. Northern states were not willing to accept the addition of another slave state, or potentially several slave states, since Texas's territory was enormous and could eventually be divided, without a fight. The balance of power in the Senate between slave and free states was a constant, agonizing political negotiation, and the admission of Texas threatened to tip it decisively. President Andrew Jackson, Houston's old mentor and hero, was sympathetic, but Jackson was a politician, and he recognized that pushing Texas annexation in the final weeks of his presidency would tear his Democratic Party apart. He did not push it. His successor, Martin Van Buren, was even less enthusiastic, and so Texas waited. The second president, Mirabeau Lamar, and the disaster of ambition.
Sam Houston was constitutionally barred from serving consecutive terms as president. In 1838, he was succeeded by Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar. And it is worth pausing for a moment on that middle name, because it tells you something important about the man. Lamar had named himself after Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a Georgia poet, a dreamer, a man of grandiose visions, and almost no practical judgment. Where Houston had been coldly realistic about Texas's limitations, Lamar was intoxicated by its possibilities. He believed, genuinely believed, that Texas could become a continental empire rivaling the United States. He wanted to expand Texas's claimed borders all the way to the Pacific. He envisioned a Texas capital on the edge of Comanche territory as a statement of destiny. He moved the capital from Houston, a city on the Gulf Coast, relatively safe and accessible, to a tiny settlement in the hills of central Texas that would be named Austin, in honor of the recently deceased founder. It was a magnificent location. It was also directly on the frontier of Comanche raiding territory. Building a capital there was either an act of visionary boldness or an act of staggering recklessness. Probably both. Lamar's financial management of the Republic was catastrophic. He expanded the paper currency supply dramatically. He funded lavish plans for institutions, a university system, a national library, that the Republic could not remotely afford. By the time his term ended in 1841, the national debt had more than tripled. The Republic was, financially speaking, close to collapse. But Lamar's most consequential decision, and his most revealing one, was his policy toward Native Americans. Where Houston had attempted, with limited success, to negotiate with the Comanche and other tribes, Lamar made no secret of his view. He wanted the native peoples of Texas gone, not accommodated, not negotiated with, removed or destroyed. His policy was, in his own framing, a war of extermination. The results of this policy would echo through Texas history for decades. Stay with us, because in a few minutes we're going to tell you about the power that none of Texas's presidents, not Houston, not Lamar, not anyone, could actually control. The power that shaped everything happening on the western frontier, the Comanche Empire. There is a power that almost every telling of the Texas Republic era treats as background noise, a problem to be managed, an obstacle to progress, something to be mentioned and moved past quickly. That is a fundamental misreading of what was actually happening. The Comanche, a military superpower on the southern plains. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Comanche Nation was the dominant military and economic power across an enormous swath of territory, stretching from what is now Kansas down through the Texas plains and into the deserts of northern Mexico. Historians have estimated that Comancheria, the lands under Comanche control, covered more than 240,000 square miles at its peak.
The Comanche had not always been a plains people. In the 17th century, they had lived in the mountains of what is now Wyoming, a Shoshonean people on the margins of the great horse cultures that were transforming the American West. Then they acquired horses, and everything changed. The Comanche became perhaps the most skilled horse warriors in the history of North America. Their horsemanship was so extraordinary that it astonished everyone who encountered them. They learned to ride before they could walk. They could fire arrows accurately at full gallop, hanging off the side of a horse using a leg hook so that they were nearly invisible to a frontal attacker. Their cavalry tactics, hit and run, dispersal, regrouping, were decades ahead of anything European-descended armies were practicing. They had completely destroyed the Spanish colonial presence in their territory. Spain, with all the resources of an empire, had tried repeatedly to establish control over the Comanche Range. They failed. The Comanche raided Spanish settlements in New Mexico and Texas with near impunity, taking horses, captives, and supplies, trading what they didn't need to other tribes and to French and later American traders on the frontier. Mexico, which inherited Spain's territorial claims, fared no better. The Mexican government that had invited American settlers into Texas in the 1820s was partly motivated by the knowledge that they could not protect their own citizens from Comanche Range. American settlers were in part meant to serve as a buffer. The economy of the Comanche Empire. The Comanche Empire was not simply a military power, it was an economic power. The Comanche controlled the horse trade across a vast region. They bred horses, captured horses, and traded horses to other nations. They participated in a complex, continent-spanning trade network that connected the Gulf Coast to the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi Valley. Their raiding was not random violence. It was systematic and economically rational. They raided Mexican settlements for horses, cattle, and captives. The captives were either adopted into Comanche society, a process that could be brutal but also surprisingly complete, with many former captives eventually becoming full members of Comanche bands, or traded back for ransom. This ransom economy generated significant wealth and kept the Comanche in constant, complex diplomatic relationship with the peoples they raided. The Comanche were also sophisticated diplomats. Different bands had different relationships with different neighbors. Some bands traded regularly with Anglo-Texan settlings, even while other bands raided the same settlements. The idea of a single unified Comanche policy was a fiction that European and American observers kept trying to impose on a reality that was far more complex. The Council House Fight, Texas's greatest diplomatic catastrophe. In March of 1840, a delegation of Comanche leaders arrived in San Antonio at the invitation of the Texas government. They came to negotiate, specifically about the question of Anglo captives held by Comanche bands. Texas expected the Comanche to return all captives in exchange for trade goods and a peace agreement. The Comanche chiefs brought one captive with them, a young woman named Matilda Lockhart, as a demonstration of good faith, with the expectation that negotiations over the others would follow.
Matilda Lockhart had been badly treated in captivity. She was traumatized, physically marked by her ordeal. The sight of her and her account of other captives still held inflamed the Texan commissioners. The Texan representatives had decided before the meeting began to take the Comanche chiefs hostage until all captives were returned. Whether this plan was wise or legitimate is a question historians have debated for nearly 2 centuries. What is not debated is what happened. When the Comanche chiefs were told they were being held prisoner, they attempted to fight their way out. The resulting battle in the Council House, a building in downtown San Antonio, was a chaotic close-quarters fight. When it was over, 35 Comanche were dead, including 12 chiefs. The Comanche warriors who had accompanied the delegation were killed in the surrounding streets. Several Texans were also killed. The political and military consequences were catastrophic. The Comanche response was immediate and overwhelming. Word of the Council House fight spread across Comancheria with shattering in retaliation, reportedly about 15 people. And then the Comanche launched the most dramatic military operation any of them had ever undertaken against Texan settlements. The Great Raid of 1840, the Comanche reached the Gulf. In the late summer of 1840, a Comanche war party of approximately 500 warriors, led by a chief named Buffalo Hump, rode south through the Texas Hill Country. They were not raiding in the usual sense. This was a deliberate, sustained military campaign designed to demonstrate that the Comanche could strike anywhere in Texas at any time and that no settlement was beyond their reach. They burned the town of Linville on the Gulf Coast of Texas. They looted its warehouses and drove cattle and horses back north. The residents of Linville, most of them, managed to escape by boat into the bay, watching from the water as their town was destroyed. The Comanche had ridden 200 miles south through the heart of Texas. They had reached the ocean. They had done it with near impunity. The Texan response, the Battle of Plum Creek, eventually stopped Buffalo Hump's force as it returned north, laden with plunder. The Texans inflicted significant casualties and recovered much of the livestock. It was, in military terms, a Texan victory, but it was a victory that followed a catastrophic failure. The Comanche had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Texan Republic could not protect its own citizens in vast swaths of its claimed territory. The capital city of Austin, established by Lamar in a fit of visionary ambition, sat on the edge of territory the Comanche could cross at will. The Texan Rangers, effectiveness, violence, and a complicated legacy. The Texan Rangers were established in 1835, even before independence, as a mobile frontier defense force. Under the Republic, they became the primary instrument of Texan policy toward Native peoples and the primary force attempting to check Comanche raids.
The Rangers were effective, and they were brutal. They adopted Comanche tactics: light cavalry, fast movement, living off the land. They carried the new Colt Patterson revolver, one of the first repeating firearms practical for mounted use, which gave them a significant advantage in firefights against bow-wielding Comanche warriors. Under leaders like John Coffee Hayes, the Rangers inflicted serious casualties on Comanche raiding parties. But the Rangers also operated with a near-total absence of legal accountability. They killed not just Comanche warriors, but Comanche women and children. They attacked peaceful camps alongside hostile ones. They functioned as a terror force as much as a defense force. Their violence against Tejano communities, which we'll discuss in the next section, was, by many accounts, systematic and deliberate. The Rangers are a celebrated institution in Texas history. That celebration almost never includes an honest accounting of what they did.
In video 27, we introduced you to Juan Seguin, the Tejano cavalry commander who rode out of the Alamo carrying Travis's last letters, who fought at San Jacinto, who served as senator and mayor of San Antonio, and who was ultimately driven from Texas by death threats from the Anglo settlers he had fought alongside. Seguin's story was not exceptional. It was representative of what happened to virtually every Tejano family in Texas in the decade after independence. Who the Tejanos were. The Tejanos were the Mexican Texan population, descendants of Spanish colonial settlers, many of them with generations-deep roots in Texas. They had been the dominant population of San Antonio de Bexar, the largest and most important settlement in Texas, for over a century. They were ranchers, farmers, merchants, soldiers, priests, civic leaders. They spoke Spanish. They were Roman Catholic. Their land grants dated back to the Spanish colonial era. Some Tejanos had fought for Texas independence from the beginning. The reasons were varied and often complex. Some shared the political grievances of their Anglo neighbors. They had also suffered under Santa Anna's centralism, and they had also valued the Constitution of 1824 that Santa Anna had abolished. Some had personal alliances with Anglo families through intermarriage and commerce. Some simply calculated that independence offered them more protection than continued Mexican authority. Others had been deeply ambivalent. They had watched Anglo settlers arrive in enormous numbers, refusing to integrate, maintaining separate cultural identities, breaking Mexican law on slavery without consequence. Their suspicions were justified. The land dispossession. The mechanism by which Tejano families lost their land in the years after independence was sometimes violent, sometimes legal, and often both simultaneously. Anglo settlers poured into Texas in the years after the Revolution. Many of them came from the American South, with deeply entrenched racial attitudes toward anyone of Mexican or Spanish heritage. To these settlers, the distinction between a Tejano who had fought for Texas independence and a Mexican who had fought against it was largely irrelevant. They were all Mexicans. And in the racial hierarchy that Anglo settlers were constructing in the new republic, Mexican meant subordinate. Land disputes erupted almost immediately. Anglo settlers challenged old Spanish and Mexican land grants, arguing that they were invalid, improperly documented, or fraudulently obtained. The courts of the new Republic of Texas, staffed by Anglo judges, using Anglo legal traditions, serving a predominantly Anglo electorate, were not sympathetic venues for Tejano land claims. Cases dragged on for years, consuming family savings and legal fees. Even when Tejano families eventually won their cases, the cost of winning sometimes left them financially ruined. In other cases, the dispossession was more direct. Anglo settlers simply moved onto Tejano land and refused to leave. They organized politically to have Tejano neighbors declared squatters on their own property. They used violence, or the threat of violence, to drive families off ranches they had held for generations. The Texas Rangers, ostensibly a frontier defense force, participated in this process. Their violence was not limited to Comanche raiders. Anglo-Texan accounts of the period document Rangers driving Tejano families from their homes, destroying property, and killing Tejano men who resisted. Juan Seguin, the full story. Juan Seguin had returned to San Antonio after the Revolution as one of its celebrated heroes. He was elected to the Texas Senate in 1838. In 1840, he became mayor of San Antonio, one of the few Tejano men to hold significant political office in the new republic. As mayor, he tried to do something that was increasingly impossible: protect the rights and property of his Tejano constituents against the encroachments of Anglo settlers. He filed complaints. He used his political position to push back against the most egregious cases of dispossession. He tried to be a bridge between two communities that were, in practice, becoming increasingly hostile to each other.
The Anglo settlers turned on him. He was accused, without credible evidence, of being a secret agent for Mexico. Rumors spread that he had warned the Mexican army of Texan movements during the Revolution, that he had betrayed his former comrades, that he was a traitor. The accusations were politically motivated and almost certainly false. But in a community where Tejanos were regarded with growing suspicion, they stuck. By 1842, death threats against Seguin and his family had become so serious and so frequent that he concluded he could not safely remain in San Antonio. He packed what he could carry, loaded his family, and crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico. The man who had risked his life to carry Travis's last letters out of the Alamo, who had commanded Tejano cavalry at San Jacinto, who had served the Republic of Texas as senator and mayor, was now living in exile in the country his revolution had fought against. Mexico initially imprisoned him on suspicion of being a Texan spy, a nearly perfect expression of the impossible position Tejanos occupied, caught between two societies that both regarded them as potential enemies. He was eventually released and served for several years in the Mexican army, fighting against the United States in the Mexican-American War that was coming. His memoirs, written in 1858, are one of the most searing documents of this entire era. Lorenzo de Zavala, the Forgotten Father. Lorenzo de Zavala was a Mexican statesman, intellectual, and former governor of the state of Mexico, one of the most distinguished political figures in Mexican politics, who had broken with Santa Anna and joined the Texan cause. He was one of the signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. He served briefly as interim vice president of the new republic. He died in November 1836, just months after the Revolution, from pneumonia following an accident. He never lived to see what the republic would do to people like him. His descendants in Texas were dispossessed of their land within a generation. What was lost? It is worth trying to quantify what the Tejano community of Texas lost in the decade after independence, because the scale is rarely acknowledged. In 1836, Tejano families owned the vast majority of the ranching land in South Texas, enormous, productive properties that their families had built over generations. By the 1850s, within 20 years of independence, most of that land had passed to Anglo ownership. Through court judgments, through fraud, through violence, through the simple grinding pressure of a legal and political system that was not designed to protect them, the Tejano ranching economy was dismantled. The cultural transformation was equally severe.
Spanish had been the primary language of San Antonio since the city's founding. Within 2 decades of independence, English was dominant. The Catholic Church remained, but the community that had built it was being pushed to its margins.
The Tejanos had not moved. The border had moved over them, and then they were treated as foreigners in the land their families had built. The Texas Revolution is remembered as a fight for freedom. That is not entirely wrong. The men who died at the Alamo were fighting for something they experienced as freedom. Freedom from what they saw as Mexican tyranny, freedom to govern themselves, freedom to build the kind of society they wanted. But there is a profound and inescapable irony at the heart of this story, because the freedom that Texan independence created was built, literally and concretely, on the labor of people who had no freedom at all. Slavery in the Republic of Texas. The numbers. In 1836, when the Republic of Texas was declared independent, there were approximately 5,000 enslaved African Americans in Texas. They had been brought there in defiance of Mexican law, which had abolished slavery in 1829. They had been reclassified as indentured servants to get around Mexican legal prohibition. They had been the hidden engine of the Texas cotton economy. The Republic of Texas's Constitution, written and ratified in 1836, didn't just permit slavery, it constitutionally protected it with unusual specificity. It prohibited the Texas Congress from ever passing any law to emancipate enslaved people. It prohibited enslaved people from being freed by their enslavers without the consent of Congress. It made Texas, legally and explicitly, a permanent slave society,